talk. And if he doesn't address the raised hands himself, we may do that. Or if we're asking questions ourselves, we will jump in. But we'd encourage you to use the raised hand feature and make this as interactive as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and then I should acknowledge Steve Sexton, who's helped plan these seminars with myself, as well as our organizing committee, Billy Pizer, Chris Timmons, and then myself and Roger and Harrison over at CenRap at NC State. So with all that out of the way, we've got Grant McDermott from University of Oregon, who's going to be talking about dams and electricity. And so Grant, take it away, please.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. I said to the people who are in on the lunch call, it's really cool that you're making this seminar available, especially for young researchers, although I'm not that young, as you'll see is from some of my cultural references in this talk, but it's a pretty neat way to meet with everyone during these pretty crazy times. So I will say something about the fires. Thanks for rescheduling me. It's been a very stressful period here. I'm extremely fortunate compared to a lot of people, but it looks like things are coming down, and now we're shipping out some of our smoke to you guys who all get to share in the love. I think we may actually be at normal air quality tomorrow if it rains, at least for a while. But yeah, if you guys see anything out there about donating or helping, there are a lot of people who do need that help, besides being in the middle of a pandemic. Just quickly echo what Paige said, since I was maybe the original MLab postdoc, although we didn't call it there, it is an amazing place. And given what's happening with the job market this year, a postdoc is, I think an MLab postdoc or something like that if you have that opportunity, I don't know if they're hiring, is amazing anytime. And that goes for a lot of postdocs, but I'm happy to talk about that too. Okay, so just to let you know, you can download these slides too if you go to GitHub. It's just on my profile, Grant McDermott, and then Tree 2020. So you can clone and you can follow along, or you can just watch me talk. So this paper is one that has been in development for some time. It was actually originally my job market paper. It's kind of been in stasis as I've had to focus on some other projects, but this provides kind of an ideal opportunity. I'm really close to getting this out the door. So I'd love to have any feedback, and I'm hoping to submit it at the end of this month. So if your comments yeah, don't hold back with those. And even if it takes me another 2 months to work them in, I'm still grateful to do that. So the punchy title here should hopefully give you a sense of what I'm trying to do. I'm going to be looking at market power as it applies to a specific resource that a lot of us know something about, and that's hydropower. And the way I'm trying to frame this paper is that it's not just an environmental paper, it has broad applicability. So we'll see if I can convince you of some of the empirical features that I think are pretty nice about the setting that I'm about to look at. So let's start with a very high level question. And what is the motivation for this paper, or at least how I'm trying to sell it? And the question is, why is market power bad? And if I asked you that, and I would normally pick on someone if I was in a live seminar, I'm pretty sure you would all give me the Econ 101 answer. And that's that market power causes deadweight loss because dominant firms have an incentive to withhold production. Now, it's not something that I doubt, and I don't think any of you doubt that either, but it turns out that this is remarkably difficult to verify empirically without the help of quite a lot of structure. And of course, there's a whole field of industrial IO that's dedicated to answering this exact question. So I don't want to come here and make the claim that there's no evidence for it. But I think it is true that identification is tough. And I also think it's true that we use the structure, we impose the structure, not because we want to, but because we have to. And so what I'm hoping to do in this paper is identify the causal impact of market power on firm behavior in a reduced form setting. And in so doing, bridge the gap between theory and empirics. So when I say, you know, identify the effect of market power on firm behavior in this reduced form setting, I really mean just use these exogenous shocks in market structure that I'm about to explain to you, and then just use it and measure the effect on firm output directly. So there's going to be very little in the way, or nothing at all, of imposed structure on this problem. Okay, so what is my approach? I'm going to exploit the formation of localized electricity markets in Norway. So again, this is a very specific context because of the empirical features that I think it offers me, that I think the lessons could apply in far broader settings. And the source of these, this exogenous variation is going to be transmission constraints in the local grid. So I'm going to show you that when electricity is flowing through these cables, at some point they become constrained. There's just a limit on the number of electrons that can flow through. And that's going to create this bifurcation in the market. And we're going to see sort of separate local markets spill out. And then that's going to create the opportunity for these firms within each of these local, now separated markets to exploit their local market power. And I think the setting is interesting because it's not as if firms are entering and exiting markets like we would see in normal situations, but actually the definition of the market itself is changing over time. And again, I'll kind of lay this out with some maps and some figures, but we're going to see that, you know, firms stay where they are, but the market in which they play is going to be changing. And that's going to affect who their competition is and how much relative market power they have. I'm going to complement this with very detailed plant level data. And that's going to be 500 Norwegian hydropower plants, which I have daily observations for, going back to 2000. And I'm also going to pair this with very rich data on electricity flows, meteorological data, bid curve data, etc. I'll go through that. The focus on hydropower in this paper, as I say, as much as I'm trying to sell the generality of this paper, I think hydropower does offer some very specific empirical advantages, and I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so what are my research questions? Well, the first one is, do firms withhold production when they gain more market power? That Econ 101 question. Second, are there welfare effects in this market? And then a third sort of subsidiary question that I've been thinking more about as the paper's developed. I don't have an exact answer, but I'm going to give you some thoughts on this at the end of the presentation is, are there environmental consequences? The answer to those three questions, just as a spoiler, as a preview, are yes, yes. And then I think there are interesting environmental consequences to think about. So just one thing I want to say quickly while I'm talking, because my screens are split here, I won't be able to see anyone raising their hand, so but please do just shout it. I think Eric mentioned that he would just butt in. Okay, so let's get to the introduction.
Hey Grant, it's Steve, and I'll be the first to butt in, I guess. How are firms going to know whether they have market power that they can exploit? That is to say, how are they going to know how the market is defined?
So I'll get to this. It's going to be a sort of a classic bidding system, a day-ahead auction. I'm going to argue that there's inertia in the system. So if you constrain the day before, you know what the market is going to be basically in the day that you're operating, that you're bidding the day ahead for. So you bid 12 hours ahead of a day ahead market. It's a classic spot market. So I'll get to the institutional features in a little bit, but the high level answer to that is that there's a lot of market information and people are able to see this.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay. So market power is a big deal. I realized this. So this quote, I'm sure many of you have seen Zoolander. This quote is not as hip as it might have been 10 years ago, but I like my cultural references like I like my academic profile pictures. They stay the same. I'm going to carry them through the rest of my career. So if one day when I'm 60 years old and I still have the photo from when I'm 30, you'll know why. But market power is really triggered off a lot of interest of late. And I think this has to do with coming out of the Great Recession and its aftermath. And we've seen a lot of sort of high profile papers, of course, litigation cases. I'm sure many of you have seen that Facebook and these tech giants have been under quite heavy congressional scrutiny lately for exploiting market power. And so the point that I want to make here is that our interest in market power, or our reignited interest in market power, is across a broad swath of areas. There's evidence now that it's responsible for stagnant wages and falling productivity shares. So, you know, increasing inequality could even be responsible for a slowdown in aggregate output. And it's happening across, you know, countries and regions and in new markets and traditional markets. So, you know, there's interesting research on how there's monopoly and power, for example, in Amazon Turk, these gig economy roles. Anyway, so market power is interesting. So, you know, what am I bringing to the table when I talk about hydropower specifically? So firstly, I should say maybe I don't have to sell this as hard to a group of resource economists as I would in some other audiences. But hydropower in of itself is important. It's the largest non-nuclear source of carbon-free energy. It's responsible for about 16% of global electricity and about 7% of just global primary energy. But beyond that, even beyond these sort of high-level stats, hydropower is important because of the way it integrates within a grid. You know, it can act as a natural battery. And so it doesn't suffer from some of these other problems that other types of renewables have. You know, it's the dispatchability of the energy source here is really important. You can ramp it up and down as you please to accommodate other sources of energy. So I'll give you one example that comes to mind. So Germany, you know, they've gone on this massive energy transition and they've tried to move away from nuclear power. It turns out that they see the best way to balance the variability of the new renewables is to establish this 2 billion cable Neuralink to Norway, and they're going to try and balance their power against Norway's, you know, hydropower battery. So I think hydropower punches above its weight, even though its weight is heavy. So that's just, you know, the economic aspect of hydropower. But I also think, and this is kind of the motivation of this paper, that hydropower is empirically unique. So firstly, it has something that it shares, of course, with other forms of electricity, is that it's this homogeneous end good. So from an empirical perspective, we don't have to worry about various complications like branding and advertising and all these things. We're dealing with exactly the same commodity that the consumer consumes. I mentioned this already, it's a dispatchable form of production, so we don't have to worry about inertia. Mar Reguant has a really nice paper where she, in the Spanish market, for example, shows that not being able to account for the starting and stopping costs of these power plants really can throw off your analysis. And she, you know, tries to dig down at that and provide some more. But again, she has to post quite a lot of structure on the problem to do that. Whereas hydropower, I just open the sluice gates and I shut them. And so the response is kind of immediate. I can respond in real time to the market. And then finally, there are zero marginal costs. Now I need to provide a slight caveat to that. But what I mean here is that, you know, operating a hydropower plant, there's no, you know, everything is bundled into fixed costs. It's the maintenance of the power plant is very low. Now, of course, you'll tell me, well, that doesn't mean that we'll just provide water, you know, forever. So production here is going to be based on the opportunity cost of water. So how much to use today versus save tomorrow. It's going to be this classic kind of stock versus flow problem. And this opportunity cost of water is known as the water value. But I'm going to try and get around that. That's a potentially tricky idea by comparing firms within the same region supplying the same market. So again, hopefully I'll be able to convince you when I talk about my identification setting. All right. Other literature, there's a lot of it. So not only focusing on the Nordic market, where I'm going to kind of drill down on, but also just, you know, electricity markets in general. And I've already pointed to some of these other studies on market power. Some I'll quickly highlight here. So I mentioned Mara Guan's paper, this really nice one, looking with inertia. Lucas Davis and Katie Hausman have a kind of a related paper where they look in California with the shutdown of the, I think it's the San Onofre nuclear power plant, and that this shutting down creates this transmission bottleneck between the north and south of California, something we've just seen in the last few weeks. There were these dramatic price spikes across the two regions because of these transmission bottlenecks. And then Matt Werman at UMass has I think we kind of had the same idea very much around the same time. So he's also looking at transmission bottlenecks and the formation of these local markets. His is in quite a different context. It's in the ERCOT market in Texas, but that's also a really nice paper. So what do I think this study brings, or what am I hoping to convince you that it brings? So one is it has this I think this really advantageous research design, which is I'm going to use this empirically unique good hydropower with the fact that these bottlenecks are occurring. I'm hoping to convince you again exogenously, and I'm going to combine this with this very detailed plant level data. So the short version is there's going to be very rich variation over quite a long period of time. I'm going to look at 14 years of data, and that's also going to allow me to map quite closely onto the theory of how a hydropower monopolist, for example, would operate.
Hey, Grant.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little more context about what these, what a hydropower firm is? So in the US, I think of hydropower as like these big kind of government organizations that manage basically a full river, and there's like a ton of constraints. So what is a firm and how much? I know Norway is like steeper and shorter, but what are the firms like, and what are the constraints that they face?
So I'll talk a little bit about the market institutions in a few slides, but just to give you, I want to clarify one thing here. I'm not talking about run-of-river hydropower. So that's very popular in some countries, Brazil, for example. But here I'm going to be talking about these dams. So it's the topography of Norway is such that it's just like the perfect place to build all these dams, these reservoirs all around the country. It's certainly not just the case that there is, these governmental institutions. Now, the main player, which is called Statkraft, has its origins as a state-owned enterprise, but it's been split off. And there's many players that could be potentially local, and that's at the national level. But there's many players that could be potentially relevant at the local level. So a lot of kind of, I want to call them municipal cooperatives. That's not quite the right word because they're not necessarily run by a municipality, but I just mean they operate in quite a local jurisdiction. So on a national scale, they could be quite, minuscule, but on a local level, if the right conditions allow for it, they could control market power quite a lot. So that's not addressing, I think, all of your questions, but let me talk a little bit more about when I get to the institutional features of this market, and then you can tell me if I've missed anything out. But I did want to clarify that we're talking about dams here, so we can be strategic about allocating our resource, not just run a river where we have to, just take whatever's coming through the flow. I'm going to take your silence as okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about theory. So this is very much an applied empirics paper, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into it, but I want to give you a high-level view of what the theory is, and it's something that should be very intuitive to all of you as natural resource and environmental economists. And basically, I'm going to contrast two situations here, and this is what I do in the paper. This is off-the-shelf theory. For competition, what you find out is that if you have perfect competition, the market's going to allocate, it's going to equalize, beg your pardon, prices across periods, according to a bog standard hoteling rule. Now, just to build on that a little bit, the way hydropower is modeled, typically, and the way that it certainly occurs in reality too, is that you have a wet period and a dry period. And in Norway, what happens is in the early spring months, and there is a huge increase in hydropower capacity as the glaciers melt and with the summer rains. So then you think about it as getting this one-time shock. You get this endowment of water, and now I have to decide how I'm going to allocate this one-time endowment over 2 periods. And of course, if I over allocate in the first, then I'm going to leave too little in the second, and vice versa. But the way the strategy works, if we just take the simplest case with, without variations in demand, then what competition will do is going to equalize prices across periods, as I said. So let's contrast that with the ultimate foil, which is a monopolist. And what happens in this case is that there's going to be resource shifting across periods. And just to frame it in the most intuitive terms possible for a group of economists, is that we're going to see if there's supply in the inelastic demand period, it's going to exploit consumers' relative inflexibility to overcharge them, and then it's going to oversupply in the more elastic ones. So why isn't it undersupplying in both periods? Well, remember, this is an infinitely repeated game consisting of 2 periods. So in the first period, I get my allocation. I've got to decide, am I going to use how much in period 1? How much am I going to use in period 2? But at the end of that period 2, the game, that round stops and the game repeats. So I need water in my reservoir at the end of period 2. So is that clear to everyone? So I want to use my full allotment of water in the bog standard case. I just have to decide how I'm going to allocate it. Am I going to undersupply in one period versus another, or I'm going to supply the same amount in both periods? And for the monopolist, the case is that, hey, I'm going to supply all of my water for looking at both periods, but I'm going to undersupply in that inelastic period. I have a pretty simple, some pretty simple math going through here, but I probably don't need to go through it for this audience. It's exactly what I said. Again, if period 1 is, if the demand elasticity for electricity is more inelastic in period 1, that's when I'll undersupply. Okay, so the testable implication here is that dominant firms should maintain fuller reservoirs in inelastic demand periods. So again, they're undersupplying, so they're keeping their reservoirs at a higher level. And that's effectively what I'm going to be testing in my empirical setup. Okay, so let's get to some of the institutional features of this market. So first things first, hydropower is utterly dominant in Norway. I've got here, it's greater than 95% of the total, but in reality, it's greater than 99 or 98% of the total. It's the richest hydropower country in the world, although there are other countries that have a lot of hydropower in regions. Oregon, for example, here in the US has a lot of hydropower, but New Zealand, Chile, other places have something similar going for them. On the demand side, winter demand, unsurprisingly perhaps, is quite a lot more than summer. It's double that of summer. So we're going to see just a higher gigawatt per hour figure for those winter months. But here's something that was pretty interesting to me. And so I want to plant a flag in it, not only because it's something I didn't necessarily expect coming from a warm country, but it's also going to affect how I interpret my results later, is that because heating is substitutable and the market fosters consumer responsiveness, so it's a very advanced market, there's real-time pricing, what we're actually going to see is that the summer period, even though it's a low demand, that's when the elasticity of demand is more inelastic. So I'm just going to plant that idea here. I'm going to show you this in a second. So think consumers are more inflexible in summer.
Grant, real quick question.
Sure.
When you say that heating is substitutable, I mean, over what time span are you thinking about? I mean, you either have your house or gas heat. You're not substituting very quickly there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's substitutable in both short and long term. So every house in Norway, just about, has a wood burning stove or heater. They have gas too, a lot of them. And of course, we can think about, over the longer term, you could think, oh, if I don't have one of those, I can put that in. But my experience living in Norway for a while was just like, if it's a cold winter's night and you can see my electricity meter running really quickly, and I'll show you this in a second, then I just will put on the gas. I mean, and we can also think about other forms of long-term substitution where you have better building codes and so forth. So I think it's substitutable in both the short and the long term. I just want to show you. Sorry, go for it.
Nord Pool, with the market being Nord Pool, I mean, is what they can do in Norway the relevant? I guess you'll probably get to this, but it seems to me like what they're doing in Germany might be the more relevant substitutability question as opposed to, or other big demand centers. Norway's a small part of the load of Nord Pool.
No, I wouldn't say it's a small part of the load. I mean, it's people use electricity there a lot. The system is very electrified. And of course, as we've seen, it's quite an extreme climate. So there'll be more demand for cooling than there or for heating potentially than there is in, say, now southern Denmark. But these markets, while there is cross-border trade, what I'm going to try and exploit again is the fact that there's a limit to how much these transmission cables can handle. I should say, just since you mentioned Germany, my study period doesn't include those newer links that are kind of going up into Norway. And I think that would throw some of my results out. In fact, I think there's some interesting follow-up studies. So I'm not sure who's speaking. I didn't hear the name, but try and remind me at the end of that, and I'll, if I don't mention, and I'll talk about some of the things I'm interested to use this data set for going further. Just quickly, sorry, yeah?
Yeah, may I ask, like it's a simple question, but I'm not familiar with this context. I'm just confused how hydro plants would have like market powers or be monopolies given they are producing a commodity, like you said in the beginning.
Well, you are, it's just in the simplest sense, I mean, I'm not saying it's exactly the same as if you were a factory producing widgets, but if you are, let's take a thought experiment where you're the only hydropower producer in a region, then of course the only way, or the only electricity producer, the only way people are going to get electricity is from your supply. So even though they're using or supplying a commodity, they can potentially at least act strategically in terms of how much and when they supply electricity. So it really just collapses into the same problem as most other things, with the exception that because it's the stocks versus flow problem, we have to think of it as this kind of variation on the hoteling rule. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So I'll just talk about, I'm trying to underscore the fact that consumers are responsive and the market is very responsive. So this is something I asked a friend of mine to send me. This is just his meter. Whenever I give this presentation, I always think you should give me a better shot of this because it's a little bit blurry. My meter in my home, for example, was like appended right next to the stove in a very sort of nice modern box. So you could actually see when you were busy cooking, you could see the meter ticking over, but this is just his. And you can see, hopefully that's clear enough over the Zoom, but you can kind of see it just swirling through. So the point that I want to emphasize here is that unlike a lot of markets, the Norwegian and the Nordic market in general are very dynamic, and they encourage consumer responsiveness. This was built into the market design of the Norwegian market and then later Nord Pool. And in fact, 80% of all contracts are tied directly, are these variable contracts that are tied directly to the spot price. So that's just ahead of, sometimes I've had this question, which is like, well, consumers don't respond to what's happening in the spot market, but I don't think that's true. And in fact, almost all studies in the Norwegian context use the spot market as their basis because, again, it is tied directly to the way consumers experience the consumption of the electricity. Okay, so that's demand and supply. And then I've already said this. I've said that perhaps surprisingly to you, summer demand, even though it's low in absolute terms, that's when it's more inelastic. So what this implies is that dominant firms are going to, my testable hypothesis here is that dominant firms are going to keep fuller reservoirs during the summer as they withhold production, and then vice versa during winter. So that's what I'm going to be looking for in my empirical setting. So the previous speaker questioner already mentioned this, Nord Pool. So Norway is part of Nord Pool. What is Nord Pool? Nord Pool is the world's first and still largest multinational power exchange. It's kind of like the poster child for efficient liberalized markets. And the foundation of this market is the day-ahead L-spot market. And this again is a classic day-ahead auction bidding system where everyone goes in, suppliers and consumers, and they bid. Then they bid for each block in each hour. And I'll show you what a bid curve looks like in this market in a second. And so wherever these two bid curves meet, just like classic demand and supply curves, that's the market clearing price. And that's what determines how the market clears. So it's also important to notice that L-spot comprises distinct bidding areas. And I'm going to show you some of these bidding areas over time. And in the paper, I have maps of them changing over time. So why am I talking about these bidding areas? Well, this is where the source of my variation is going to come from. And the driver of this variation is transmission constraints. And in the absence of any transmission constraints, there's going to be a common system price in all areas. We literally call it the system price. And so every area in Nord Pool and within Norway is going to have the same price. However, as soon as these transmission constraints are binding, and they bind a lot, areas are going to become their own separate markets. So, if you're familiar with electricity design or electricity markets, you're familiar perhaps with nodal designs or area designs. This is one of those where you're going to split up into separate bidding areas. And what this means is that, no matter the internal constraints within an area, every consumer or every participant in that area is going to get the same price. So within areas, there's a uniform price, but between areas, that's when prices can diverge. And again, I'll show you some graphics of this in a second. So I've mentioned this several times now, but this idea of creating local markets because of binding constraints, creates the opportunity for exploiting local market power, which I am in turn am going to exploit in my empirical identification. So here is a very stylized example. I'm sure many of you have kind of already grokked this, but let me just put it into pictures. I'm someone who likes to think visually anyway. So imagine we have the stylized market here. Let's say we have 5 firms, each exactly the same size. So we have 3, the blue firm has 3 power plants and the red firm has 2 power plants. So when there's no constraints in the market, then just because of my simple assumptions for this very simple example, the blue firm is going to have 60% of market share and the red firm is going to have 40% of market share. Now, what happens is, let's say the market is divided up into these 2 potential regions. If the bottleneck across these 2 regions, if that becomes binding, well, then these 2 regions separate. And now what we have are these kind of interesting dynamics where we see that, well, firstly, we've created 2 separate markets, and we see that there's interesting variations in treatment here, because on one hand, the blue firm becomes a monopolist in this left-hand region, but it also loses market share in the right-hand region, whereas the red firm gains market power, now becomes the dominant market power firm. So what I want to say here is that this variation in treatment, it affects firms and plants in different ways. It gives them a boost of market power in some regions and a decrease in others. So I'm not just looking at a single, change, single shock to a firm, the same over time. These shocks vary both in the magnitude and the direction. And that's going to allow me to trace out quite a rich identification, a treatment for, so I beg your pardon, for my identification. Okay, so speaking of identification, there's actually two layers here that I'm trying to exploit. Sorry, I see a question. Billy, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just a quick question on the previous slide that maybe I missed something with a little blue and red dot. I guess I was imagining that the market power was being, was a period of people holding back supply and boosting price, right? So why is the red market share going up when you separate? Like, I would have thought the red would actually give the blue. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not thinking about how oligopolies work, because I'm not sophisticated.
Yeah. Well, so no, but there are layers here, of course, and I'll talk about how I'm going to measure market power in a few slides, which will maybe clarify some of this confusion. Okay. I'm just saying that imagine we just measured market power as simply the share of production. Now, of course, that's not a very strong measure of market power, because what matters is how much do you have relative to consumption. And that's the measure that I'm going to try and look at. But I'm just saying here, like, if I had to look at which firm controls, the lion's share of production in a particular region,
it changes.
It changes. And again, the point that I was trying to emphasize here is that it's interesting because, the blue firm can have a positive and a negative shock. And then, at least according to theory, it should manage its plants differently depending on what type of shock it gets. And that's something that I'm going to be testing. So in this really stylized example, let's forget about consumption, how that maps onto this. Let's just say that, this really was an increase in market power. What my results should say is, hey, during these inelastic summer months, because these power plants got more market power, they should be withholding water. Whereas this one, even though it belongs to the same firm, because it's lost market power, it should now have less water in, because it's supplying the market at a greater level. Okay, so I have these two layers of exogenous variation that I'm hoping to convince you of. So the first one is the transmission constraints themselves, and this is what we just kind of saw on the previous slide, the stylized version, and this, I like to think of it as the ultimate mechanism for changes in market power. This is the why. Why do firms gain or lose local market power? And I would argue here the exogeneity is determined by basically physical factors. It's the physical nature of electricity. There's only so many electrons that can flow through a cable at any one time. And it's geographically very difficult. And we see this, in electricity markets all over the world, but especially in a place like Norway, which has this crazy topography, to lay down new cables. It's, it's very expensive to sink and build a cable under a fjord and then over a mountain and pass some trolls, whatever, okay? So that's this first layer of variation. In fact, if I click on a live link here, if this works, I'll show you, this is the real-time market. This is the Norwegian market and in fact, the Nordic market as a whole in real time. Now, my concern whenever I present the slides, I do it during US time. So this is like the dead of night, or just about. We're getting close to that in Norway. So it's not as much variation as you would see normally. But you can see there actually is some price variation here. So we can see that these regions have separated out. There's a single price binding for these three. It's 1063. You can see here. And then there's a slightly lower price for this NO3 region. So, these areas are experiencing more high relative demand relative to this one. And then right in the north of Norway, I don't know if you can see that this says 763. So there's, the market is less constrained up here in the north. And then you can see electricity is flowing across these regions. And within Sweden too, you can see that there's price variation between this region and that region. And so again, within these three regions, the market is unconstrained, unconstrained in the transmission sense, but across these three to these other two, you can see that now there's a price differentiation. So that's basically just the real-time version of the stylized graph that I showed you on the previous slide. So we have that. And then we also have another interesting dynamic that I think is quite useful, the paper. So these bidding areas, the ones that I just showed you, they are demarcated, and when there's a transmission bottleneck, they break off into these predefined regions. And Steve, maybe I think this goes back to one of your earlier questions about, how do participants know where they're going to be, playing, so to speak. So it breaks off into these predefined regions. But these predefined regions, and there's 5 of them at the moment, they have themselves changed over time, and they change for interesting regions. They change, at least from an empirical sense. If you read the forms, they change because of maintenance. So they actually want to go in and put a big new cable in, and then regions have to be reconfigured for a year or 2. Or they change because they add Finland to the mix, and that causes a downstream reconfiguration within Norway. Or they change because of climate and geography and factors like that. So if I show you what that one looks like. So this was the current region, the region today, but a few years ago it looked like that. You see, and so what I'm doing in this case is imagine a firm that was located, or a group of firms that were located here. When there was binding transmission constraints, they would be playing in NO5, but a few years ago, oops, pressing the wrong button, they would be playing in NO1. And you can see the market, the definition of these bidding areas themselves has been changing over time. Let me go back here. Oops. Okay, so that's cool, I think, because again, it adds richness to my empirical strategy, or my empirical analysis, I should say, because it affects the magnitude of this change. How much market power do firms get when transmission constraints are binding? And that, again, is something I can exploit temporally going back over time.
Grant, looks like Emily.
Yeah, go for it.
Emily?
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me? Got it. I'm wondering the extent to which your market power specification depends on assuming that each plant is operating at capacity, so that competing plants do not have the ability to adjust to the changing size of their respective markets or their competitive landscape. Is that the case? Is that an important assumption?
It is I think the strongest assumption I make in the paper. I don't think it's that strong, but I'll talk a little bit about it. Let me say something about it now. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to always look at like for like. I'm going to look at firms within the same region. I'm going to look at firms within the same market. And so that's important because they're serving exactly the same consumption base, right? So you can think of it as, just adding fixed effects to the model. Basically, I'm going to be treating, if me and my wife Lorraine sitting in the background there trying to be quiet, if we're competing in the same market, whether, if we're right next to each other, and imagine we're also the same size firm, so I also control for, reservoir size and other characteristics like that. If I know that Lorraine's parent firm gets a shock of an increase in market power, and I don't, then any residual observed differences in our behavior, I think, can reasonably be attributed to the fact that we had this differential shock in market power. And I see that's awakened the beast here, because there's now a few participants raising your hands. Go for it. Who wants to go first? Anyone?
Oh, I'll go. I may have missed this, but what are these bidding regions changing? Is it because of capacity constraints or like change in migration patterns?
It's physical constraints in how many electrons can flow through a cable. Okay. So think of it as imports. There's like a limit to how many imports we can get from one region. And it's a bit more complicated than that because it also depends on what's happening in other areas. You know, power is going to flow to where it's most needed, but just think about it. Let's take a very stylized example. If we have like a crazy demand shock in one part of the country, there's only so much we can get from other parts of the country to help bail us out. And then everything else has to be supplied by my local producer. And I think the only other hand up is Billy.
Oh, no, sorry, that was from before.
Oh, sorry. And then I have one other person. Sorry, I don't actually get to see your name here. So just please shout out if you got your hand up.
Sorry, Grant. I just had one follow-up, which was, I'm assuming you have some data on capacity. You have reason to believe that these plants are, in fact, operating close to capacity?
Yeah, and I'll talk about how this becomes a complicated problem. I'll say complicated. I know the average annual production of each plant, so I'm going to talk about how I think about how much they could supply on any one day. Now, I should say something. Sorry, I perhaps should have made this clear. You know, I'm focusing on the dams a lot. In an ideal world, I might look just directly at the electricity bids, but those are anonymized. I actually don't get to view them. I see them at an aggregate, but I don't know, you know, Statkraft West bid in, 500 megawatt hours at 20 krona. I don't see that, but I do observe their reservoir. So that's what I'm, you know, there's obviously a good mapping between those two things. Any other questions? I don't think so. Emily, hopefully that answers. I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about, you know, the measure of market power in a sense. But okay, so that's the basic idea. I have, you know, these transmission constraints cause these local markets, and they affect how much power, the relative magnitude of market power. And this is, I think, something that's pretty neat about this paper. It's not just a one-time shock; it's a recurring shock at different levels. So it's gonna give me a much richer sense of how firms respond at different levels of market power. Okay, so data, I have a lot of it. I have hydropower reservoirs going back 14 years. It's the 500 largest reservoirs in Norway. So it's approximately 2 million observations. That's 90% roughly of total system capacity, certainly the biggest hydropower plants. And each of these is a link to, you know, other important covariates. I know the producing plant, or if there's more than one plant on a dam, the plant IDs. So I know who the parent producer is. I have a bunch of GIS information, etc. So I'm able to control for quite a lot of things, and I'll show you what these reservoirs look like in a second. I also have electricity flows and prices over the same period, and this is actually hourly data, although I will have to aggregate everything up to the day level because that's what my hydropower, the dam measurements are at. But I have prices and flows per bidding area of the same period. I know the transmission constraints. I know how much was imported. I know how much was demanded in each region. I know, you know, if there was I know what the exact constraint across the border was. I know whether that was hit. I know, you know, which areas formed a single price region versus other areas. So I have all of that information too. I also have bid curve information from 2014, 2017. Now, this is not within my sample period, but in a sense, that doesn't matter. It's a kind of a moot point because all that I want electricity bid curve data for is it allows me to get a direct measurement of the demand elasticities. I'm going to be able to take, you know, I'm just going to be able to measure them off these bid curves. I'll show you what the bid curves look like in a few slides, but this is useful because I'm just looking for stuff that's kind of constant over season. I'm looking, is demand more inelastic in general in summer than in winter? And then finally, I have a lot of precipitation, general weather data. It turns out Norway has got lots and lots and lots of weather stations. And so I'm able to match each power plant to the closest weather station or stations, sorry, each reservoir. So I get a good sense of local meteorological conditions. So this is what my hydropower reservoirs look like. So I've got a kind of an dynamic map here, but this is the final configuration in my paper. So we have 5 different regions. You know, we've got this one right in the north, and then we've got like a central region, and then a western region, southern, you know, and this is the eastern region where Oslo is. And then each of these, you know, I can, if I zoom in on one, I can click on each of these reservoirs, and it'll tell me, okay, for this final bidding period, you know, this was the volume, this is the capacity of this reservoir, Døkfløyvatn, if I pronounce it correctly. It's going to tell me who the owner firm is, and then what percent of, you know, what share of total production it has, etc. And then I can click, you know, I can go and click on a much smaller plant here. So I click on this one, and interestingly, you know, this is a case in point. Even though this reservoir itself is pretty small, it's in fact really small, it belongs to a hydropower firm that controls quite a lot of the share of production. So this is simply to say that, you know, it doesn't matter to me necessarily, although it is a covariate that I like to control for as well. But small firms, small hydropower dams can be operated the same potentially as big hydropower dams if they belong to the same parent company with a lot of market power. And then of course I have this going back for all different configurations that were possible in my 14-year study period. Oh, sorry, this figure's come out a little bit funny, but this is what bid curves look like. I'm contrasting here the month of June and November. I think this is 2013. Sorry, my legend's just being cut off here. But you can see basically that. So I've got, you know, hourly bid curves, and this is what they look like at the aggregate level. And so November is June is the blue, and November is the red. I think I remember that correctly. And I'm basically able to trace off the demand elasticities for each of these hours of the day and across each month of the year, and just measure directly these demand elasticities. And so I'll get a sense again of how much these demand elasticities, what are the kind of the seasonal effects, and basically I boil it down to month. How inelastic is demand for January versus June versus October versus December. And so I'm just getting that directly kind of from the data. It turns out that my results are of somewhat reassuringly very similar to other people who've used other methods, you know, co-integration techniques to measure demand elasticities or other methods. But I think it's nice whenever we can to measure the data directly. Okay, so this goes back to Billy's question, which is the measure of market power. So a naive measurement would maybe be something like the Herfindahl index, or maybe just the share of production. That was actually the naive measure of market power that I used in that very simple figure previously. But of course, what really matters in terms of electricity markets is how much capacity do I have, how much supply do I have relative to what's demanded. And if you drill down that a little bit further, that just invites the natural next question, which is basically how difficult is it to meet, sorry, this should say demand. How difficult is it to meet demand without firm F's production? So, you know, if I'm a player on the local market and every other firm has bid in and I kind of hold back, does that really cause disparities or cause a dramatic price increase because I'm withholding my demand? RSI, as it's known, and this is the measure that I'm talking about again here. It's just total capacity minus firm F's capacity divided by total demand. That's very common to use in electricity markets because people have recognized that these traditional measures, these industry concentration measures, lack something. Something that I want to point out is that the way this is measured, a decrease in RSI actually corresponds to an increase in market power. And it turns out that if RSI is less than 1, well, that means that the firm is pivotal. We actually cannot meet demand without that firm supplying at least something. So I'm just conscious of the time here. I construct basically 4 different measures of RSI. And this has to do with the fact of how I'm trying to measure gigawatt hours that each plant has available to them. This is something Emily asked earlier. So I detailed this more in the paper, but basically I'm going to measure RSI as a function of, I know each plant's average output per year, and I know the daily demand and supply. So what I do is I kind of downscale that to the daily or the monthly level, and I look at things like, okay, I'm going to assume that the relevant area is an area that was constrained. So, you know, I know that the amount of electricity flowing from one region to the next was at the bottleneck. And then I do a version of that where I'm seasonally adjusting. So I'm saying, okay, well, let's assume that I don't just say, you know, I can take my yearly output and divide it by 365. Let's say I actually seasonally adjust, and I probably quite sensibly say that firms, okay, supply more in the winter months than they do in the summer months. And then I do a version of that that's price-based, where I say, okay, don't just pay attention to what's actually happening at the border with these transmission constraints. Actually look at the realized price areas, the areas that were formed. So that's a slight variation. If we have time at the end, I can expand on it, but I am conscious that we're running out of time. The take-home measures that I hope to convince you of is that I've tried to be careful with how I can construct this residual supply index, and I've tried different measures, and it turns out that it doesn't make too much of a difference because they actually correspond quite nicely. And so here is just a histogram of my different measures of RSI, residual supply index, across different configurations. So just think of this as moving through time in Norway for this Nordic market. And we can see that they kind of have a similar shape. Anything to the left of this solid black line, that means that they're firms that are pivotal. That's what I said earlier. These firms could certainly exploit market power, because without them putting into the market, we actually can't meet demand. All right, econometrics. So if all has gone to plan, hopefully I've convinced you that I have this nice empirical setting that allows me to abstract from a lot of, you know, complications that would requires quite a lot of imposed structure, and that I have this truly exogenous variation in these shocks to market power. And so because of that, what I'm trying to hang my hat on in this paper is that the empirics, so the data collection and, you know, wrangling, that took a lot of work, but the actual regressions are pretty simple. And all it is basically is the following. My dependent variable is going to be the reservoir volume. So I'm going to use just the % of maximum regulated capacity. You know, how full is it relative to how full it is allowed to be. And I'm going to run it on a bunch of seasonal dummies. So these are monthly dummies. This is going to control for just regular seasonal inflow into my dams, you know, due to the glaciers melting and so forth. But then I'm going to add this other term, which is the seasonal variation interacted with my measure of market power. Now I've got the negative sign on RSI here because you remember it goes the other way around. When RSI decreases, market power increases, and this is just to make my figures look nice, but it's the same idea. And then I have a bunch of control variables: temperature, plant zone, fix to fix, etc. I'm going to cluster areas. I'm sometimes rude about cluster police, but this is a case where you absolutely have to cluster the areas, because every firm within a region is going to receive exactly the same shock. Yeah, sorry, every plant belonging to a firm. So I'm going to cluster them at the firm and the price or the zone level, depending on my measure of RSI. So again, if all the firms, you think about that stylized example, all the blue plants to the left of my little diagram, those plants received exactly the same increase or decrease in market power. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at. And so my main parameter of interest here is going to be these gamma parameters. And again, that's just showing me how reservoir volumes vary by month of year according to how much market power I get at that time. And that's a direct link to the theory. So here are the results. First, I'll just show you my measures of demand elasticities. So these are the actual monthly measurements of demand elasticities that I get. And what that does, pretty simple translation, the implied reservoir volumes, what I get is that, I've kind of said this verbally already, but what I'm expecting is something like this shape, this kind of sinusoidal shape. I'm expecting that I'm going to see higher reservoir volumes for firms that have market power in the summer months, and then lower volumes once we get to the winter months. And this is just going directly from the theory, taking my observed demand elasticities and just kind of making a stylized example. So let's see what the actual data show me. So I run a bunch of regressions, different models. This is probably the simplest version I do, and it kind of has that sinusoidal shape. And again, we can see firms here certainly withholding production. This is the effect of a 1% decrease in RSI. So again, I get more market power. This is an effect on my reservoir volumes. And then I do kind of increasingly more complicated versions of the model. I would say model 3 and model 4 are the strongest just from a empirical, a theoretical standpoint, I think. And here you can see the sinusoidal shape come up very beautifully in the data. Again, this is showing, basically it's showing if I get a shock to market power, I get more market power. What does that mean for my reservoir volumes? Well, if I get a shock to market power, I'm withholding more water. I have higher reservoirs, so I'm withholding power in the summer, exactly as my theory predicted, and then oversupplying in the winter months, again, exactly as my theory predicted. And I try a lot of different things, many different regressions and versions of this, but no matter what I do, I can't kill the sinusoidal shape. And I think it persists because it really is there in the data. And I do a measure of discrete market power. Again, if I pass this one threshold where I become pivotal, and again, I see something similar here. I don't want to hang my head on the pivotal results because it's such a fine threshold. If there's any measurement error, that's going to cause problems, but just they're within the same ballpark, I would say. Okay, because of the wildfires, I was really hoping to have additional welfare measurements in the paper that I kind of had to put on hold. This was an early attempt of mine to kind of put a number on the cost of this. The thought experiment here is basically how much do prices change because of constraints in the system. And we can see this is the month of June, and we can see that prices are about anywhere between 3 to 5 euros per megawatt higher. This is the observed price, and they would have been in an unconstrained system. And the reverse is true in the winter months, because this is when dominant firms are oversupplying. Just before the presentation, I don't even know if it makes sense to put this in, I kind of did this new simulation, which I think I'm going to put into the paper. I think this is the more sensible one. This is comparing observed versus a counterfactual gigawatt hourage. And you can see how they diverge over the months of the year. I'm going to take that and I'm going to translate that into actual numbers. So look at, hopefully in the next week or so. All right, just in time. So my conclusions, what I try and do in this paper, what I hope I convinced you, is that I've got this really unique empirical setting with a confluence of fortuitous factors. And this creates this exogenous variation, which creates localized electricity markets. And again, the neat thing here is that firms stay where they are, but the definition of the market itself changes over time. And so that creates this variation in local market power that's driven by these transmission constraints. I'm able to match that with very rich data on these Norwegian hydropower firms, electricity flows, and meteorological data. My empirical results, I think this is neat. They accord very closely with the predictions of theory. So we see that firms, exactly as predicted, withhold when demand is relatively inelastic and oversupply in the reverse. I think there's reasons to view these results as a lower bound, certainly on what market power effects have. I don't want to oversell the fact that this is an I'm not trying to be too Procrustean about it. This is a competitive market, but I think the idea here is that even very nominally competitive markets are susceptible to manipulation and welfare losses. And very briefly, since we talked about it somewhere in the study, in the talk, something that I'm quite excited about for potential follow-up is to think about how this interplay between my decision as, if I get a shock to market power, does that affect how I'm willing to accommodate a surge in renewables? So let's, once this cable between Norway and Germany is complete, and we think about the cables that have been built from Denmark to Norway, even the offshore Norwegian wind, we assume typically in these power models that hydropower will just accommodate it. It's just easy to turn the gates on and off, but maybe there's some interaction here that could change that dynamic. Or maybe it's the case that these intermittent renewables, because they have also zero marginal costs, that kind of completely ameliorates the ability of these dominant local firms to exploit market power. So that's all I have. I think I've just made it before the bell. Again, these slides are over here. I'm going to post an updated version of the paper fairly soon, but I'd love to hear any other feedback or questions you have. So Eric, I don't know, it's hard for me to see who's actually raised their hand unless I'm going to take.
Let's do Harrison and then Emily.
Hey, Harrison.
So, as someone who recently had a transmission paper go through the review process, one thing that came up in our reviews was the pipelines are exogenous, the transmission cables are exogenous, but what creates a constraint across those cables may not be exogenous, was a comment that we commonly got. So it depends on what producers are doing on either side of the boundary, and that could be related to the competitive nature on either side of the boundary.
So
I think about that.
I'd actually love to talk to you. So I presented at the ASSAs, and Frank Wallach was my discussant, and he brought this up too. So my strategy for doing this, it's evolving. Let me say that. But one thing I'm planning to do as a robustness check, for example, I've got a couple things in mind. I haven't got that in the paper now, and it's important that you brought it up. One thing is I'm going to look specifically around points where there's like an unexpected shock in these constraints. So again, a line can go down because of maintenance, or there's kind of these recurring cases where I think plausibly it's very difficult to predict ahead of time that, or at least it changes the dynamic of what the constraint is. So I'm going to look for variation around that. I've also been thinking of instruments as an additional thing. It's very well known in this literature that heat affects the capacity of there's, basically transmission is a function of thermal capacity through these lines. So there's a couple of things like that, but I would love to hear your thoughts. The two main things I have to do for the paper still are I've just got to polish up the welfare effect, and I think I need to put those additional things in. So maybe we can chat offline. I'll definitely send you an email after this.
Sure. And then real quickly, somewhat relatedly, so often we think about market power in electricity sectors as the inframarginal generator withholding production to move us up the supply curve. But here we're like a complete world of almost zero cost producers. So is there something to be said about who within these regions is the withholder of production? And does that follow any sort of theory? I have no idea a priori what theory.
Well, the theory is kind of what I alluded to earlier, which is just that I think the most reasonable assumption is that we treat all of these firms as they have exactly the same production technology, they're serving exactly the same consumers. We should treat them equally. And you can kind of see that on the bid curve too. You know, you can see that there's not this great dramatic variation in supply, at least. But there is a variation that I'm interested in, and that's looking at kind of firms by size, for example. And maybe I need to see whether there's a Statkraft effect. Someone, I think it was Steve earlier, mentioned, are these quasi-governmental entities? And I wouldn't call Statkraft that, but you know, maybe there's some lingering thing, or maybe they've got the scrutiny of the regulator is more heavily focused on them. So they could be acting a little bit differently than other firms. You know, I'm assuming all of them are kind of equally sophisticated and strategic. That's potentially not true. You know, maybe bigger firms are more sophisticated at being able to game the system or to act strategically given the way that these market conditions kind of arise. But at the moment, I am just treating them all as equally. It is something to think about, though.
All right, so it's 4:15, so I'm going to go ahead and thank Grant, but we're going to have time afterwards. I'll stay on, and others for any questions that we have. We've got Emily and Billy, but just wonder, those of you who want to go, I'm releasing you, so to speak. And so thank you all for coming, and we have Claire Balboni next week. So in the chat, there's a place to sign up for that if you haven't already. So thank you all for coming. And I guess, yeah. So now, Emily, you have a question, then Billy.
Yes, I really liked the identification strategy here. I just wanted to make sure I'm interpreting the sinusoidal figures correctly. Because I was confused why you end up seeing the sign flip in the winter months. I would have thought you would see a smaller magnitude of effect in the winter months when demand is more elastic, but I'm not sure why the sign completely flips.
So,
or I might not be interpreting it correctly.
So I kind of I skipped through the theory there pretty quickly. It's not complicated theory, and you can certainly see it in the appendix or even in the appendix of the slides. But what you do basically, according to theory, is you allocate proportionally. If you only have two periods and one's elastic and one's inelastic, you have exactly the same proportional response on the winter months as the summer months. If you start introducing 4 periods, then you take, you know, the most extreme inelastic period and you pair that with the most inelastic period, and you kind of you have this smoothing effect. Again, it's just a direct implementation of hoteling, of how you're going to kind of smooth supply over the period. So the reason it's sinusoidal is because you don't withhold the same magnitude for all the relative inelastic months. You withhold the most in the most inelastic month. And of course, there's this cumulative effect too. I talk about this in the paper, but you know, if I withhold in May and then I withhold a bit more in June, that the distance between my reservoir as someone who has market power versus someone who doesn't is going to grow, even though the elasticity doesn't change necessarily. That's maybe a bit too abstract. Hopefully I've given you a sense though. Again, I think I detailed this better in the paper, how I'm going to map from these observed elasticities in my theory to my predictions. I'll take silence as an okay.
Well, I guess because I thought the y-axis was you know, the incremental effect of another, you know, unit of market power. It's just interesting that then in the winter months, firms with more market power than releasing more water from their from the reservoirs. So I'm just, yeah, I'd have to look at the theory to figure out why, so, okay, market power is causing these extremes of
Okay.
withholding and producing.
Well, I mean, maybe I misunderstood you, but the reason you produce, so imagine I withhold in the summer. Remember that this game is going to end. There's no value to me withholding at the end of the year because my reservoir is going to be replenished. So everything that I don't supply is just kind of wasted production, even if I sell it at a cheap price. And so that's why in the winter months, whatever I've held back relative to what I might have, if I was in a competitive state, I might as well supply that because that's better than just having that go to waste in once my reservoirs replenish. But I do think that's interesting, and a lot of, so something that's a little bit frustrating, I think, about other papers, that they look around these very narrow price deviations. It's very typical structural stuff, Bresnahan, Lau, etc. And they're just looking for like short run price deviations. But if we actually think about the theory of this hydropower producer, it's a classic resource econ story about how we're going to allocate the stock over time. And that has not these short run implications, although there are of course short run implications in any power market, but there's an implication for how I decide to allocate my resource over time. And that's something that I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to map closely to the theory that's kind of underpinning what I'm looking at.
Billy.
Yeah, you flashed a slide right towards the end about welfare. What was that? Could you just repeat that? I didn't get the story.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit nervous to put the welfare up there because I think it is still rough and ready. So that's maybe why I skimmed through it quite quickly. I'm happy to put it back up. But basically the idea was I did a very crude analysis. I just basically took my results of how much water would be withheld by a dominant firm. And I make an assumption about, it's an empirical assumption. I look at how much market power increase there is for firms under constraints. And then I assume that they do a directly proportional response in terms of gigawatt hours. So my empirical model says for every 1% increase in market power you get, I withhold, I have my reservoirs, I think 1.2% higher. So then I just say, I translate directly to gigawatt hours and I say, okay, then this firm supplied, I actually in that version I showed you, I go even one level coarser. I assume it at the aggregate level. There was 1.2% less electricity supplied in the market for that month of June. So what does that translate to in terms of prices? And I just go back to my elasticity measurement and I say, okay, what's a 1.2% deviation or reduction in production that leads to this much percent increase in price. And so what I was showing you there was like, a crude counterfactual of how much higher prices are because of these constraints. The other, I showed you a second welfare figure. It's not even in the slides, where I'm basically trying to do something more sophisticated, which is I'm really trying carefully to trace out the deviations in gigawatt hours in a more thorough way, I would say. And that's still kind of work in progress, but I just wanted to show you that I tried it, and weren't it for the dramatic wildfires in Oregon, you would have been celebrating my wonderful welfare effects. I'm sure about it. I have no doubt. Would have been talk of the town. You'd have dined out for weeks.
Thank you.